So welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name's Darlene McLennan, and I'm the manager of the Australian Disability Clearinghouse on Education and Training, or ADCET for short. I'm a white woman who is in my 50s with grey-brown hair, with glasses, and wearing a bright orange shirt today. This webinar is live captioned. To activate the captions, click on the CC button in the toolbar that's either located in the top or bottom of your screen. We also have captions available via the browser, and we'll put that into the chat now, the URL into the chat now if you'd like to access it there. I'm on Lutruwita, Tasmanian Aboriginal land, and in the spirit of reconciliation, ADCET respectfully acknowledges the Lutruwita nations and also recognises the Aboriginal history and culture of the land. And I pay my respects to elders, past and present, and to many Aboriginal people that did not make elders status. I also acknowledge all the countries participating in this meeting, and also acknowledge elders and ancestors and their legacies to us and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in the webinar. I invite you now to add to the chat on which country you're in. Today's webinar, Autistic Students and the Transition to University, Findings and Recommendations, will be presented by Alison Nuske, PhD from Alison's, Dr. Alison, sorry, I should say. I'm referring to her that now. PhD research exploring the experience of autistic students during their transition to and first year of university in Australia. Alison will provide recommendations for developing a holistic approach to supporting autistic students during this critical time. We're very fortunate to have Alison. It's kind of like, I feel like saying it's hot off the press, but Alison only received her PhD last week. So I feel very fortunate that we have her sharing her findings and providing us information today. So thank you so much, Alison. Before we begin, a few more housekeeping details. This webinar is being live captioned by Jason from Bradley Reporting and will be recorded. The recording will be made on ADCET in the coming days. If you have any technical difficulties, you can email us at admin@adcet.edu.au. Alison will talk for around 50 so minutes, and at the end, I'll ask some questions. If you could put the questions in the Q&A box, that's where I'll get the questions from, but also encourage you to chat throughout the presentation in the chat, as people often do. All right, so that's it. I'll hand over to you, Alison, and I'll see everybody back at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Darlene. As Darlene mentioned, I'm here today to present the findings and some recommendations from my PhD research. And I did want to just take a moment to thank my supervision team, Dr. Fiona Ralotta, Associate Professor Michelle Bellin, Dr. Jessie Shipman, and Professor Amanda Richdale, who supported me throughout my candidature over the last 7 years. And I also wanted to take this opportunity to thank ADCET for supporting me during my PhD and assisting with promoting and recruitment, but also thank the participants who took part to provide their insights into the experience of transition and providing support during transition, without which I wouldn't have been able to complete this research. Before I begin today, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which I'm presenting from, which is the Paramonk land. And I would like to pay respects to elders past and present. And I also extend my respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are attending today. So just a really quick background, just to give a bit of context. I started my PhD when I was working as an access and inclusion advisor at the University of South Australia. I was there for about 9 years with a couple of stints teaching in between. But I first started working in the field of autism over 15 years ago when I was working as a developmental educator and a consultant at Autism SA, which is our state-based autism support organisation. So I've worked in this area for some time, and working in the higher education setting, recognised a need for some additional knowledge and understanding around supporting autistic students, but particularly in that first year in the transition phase. And that's how I came to do this project. I also wanted to note that as an autistic autism researcher myself, you'll notice that throughout this presentation, I do refer to identity first language using autistic rather than person with autism. This is a personal preference, but is also something that has been acknowledged in several research articles of late. That is a preference for a lot of autistic people, but I do want to acknowledge that it's not necessarily a preference for all autistic people. So I do want to emphasize that when you're working with colleagues or students who may be autistic, it's really important to find out what their preference is and to reflect that language and respect that choice. The overall plan for today, I just wanted to provide a brief background of how I came to do this research and the setting in which this research took place, a really brief summary of the method that was undertaken to conduct this research, and then importantly talk about the findings from this research and the recommendations that I have in terms of supporting transition and supporting first year experiences for autistic students at university. While the study itself was undertaken in Australia and the interviews were conducted with Australian students and their support people, it's really useful to consider how this might apply a bit more broadly as well, and definitely has some international application as well. So I just want to give that context at the beginning. So when I looked at the background for this, the setting, particularly in Australia and internationally as well, there's been a really big significant shift towards promoting widening participation over the last 30 plus years, and a move towards recognising ways to improve the participation rates of students from previously underrepresented groups. And this commenced in Australia with publication of the A Fair Chance for All report in 1990, and was also underpinned by the introduction of the Disability Discrimination Act in 1992, and then following state and national legislation, including the Disability Standards for Education, which were introduced in 2005. And so that's the background of the research that I was conducting, and most of the students that I spoke to had commenced their university studies in the past sort of 10 to 15 years. So it was within the scope of that acknowledgement of the need, to increase participation of students with disabilities as well as students from other previously underrepresented groups. The reason that I chose to look at first year specifically was because of the really critical nature that first year plays for student success. It's one of the most crucial years in terms of retention, and if students are likely to drop out, this is often a really significant point in time that may occur. But it's also a really significant time in terms of not just for students but for universities. So it's a critical time in that first year to make sure that we get things right. And previous research, including a literature review that I conducted earlier in my studies, highlighted the difficulties that students, particularly autistic students, face in seeking help and finding support. And a lot of that research focused on the students as needing to develop help-seeking skills, and that from that perspective. So I really wanted to look at whether there were some other factors as well that might be impacting on students' success in their first year. And I also noticed that a lot of research that was being undertaken in the space supporting autistic students, there was a lot of research looking at what support students need, but it wasn't looking at how to get them access to that support. So there was a lot of things that even when I was working as an access and inclusion advisor, we knew we needed to provide, but how do we connect students with support? How do we make sure that they're supported early? And often students were accessing that support perhaps a year or two into their studies, which probably isn't the optimal way of providing that support. So I wanted to specifically focus on how we can make that transition more successful. And looking at the experiences of autistic students, we know that there is an increasing number of autistic students enrolling in universities. We know that they have lower completion rates than that of their peers. And we also know that they have higher rates of or underemployment than their peers, both with and without disability. So it's really important for us to explore how we can make these experiences more successful, support students to engage with their studies early on, and hopefully support them to continue and complete their studies. For the purposes of this research, it's important to recognise that transition is not an easy concept to define. And so the key points that I wanted to just highlight in relation to transition is that it's not fixed or linear. Often when we talk about the first year of university, I think the first thing we think of is that chronological, the first 12 months. And for all of the students that I spoke to, it wasn't necessarily a clear-cut 12-month period in which they completed their first year of studies. And I think that's something that's particularly important in this space to keep in mind. And it's also not the same for every student. So I wanted to make sure that when I was talking about transition and first year, that concept had enough flexibility to cover whatever the student felt was their first year of university, their transition experience of university. So we talked about things that happened in the early stages, things that they prepared for before transitioning to university, and then that sort of first, until they felt that they had sort of settled into university as that kind of transition. What was really important to keep in mind is that's a really clear time of adjustment and adaptation, particularly for students who are coming directly from high school, but also from students that might be coming to study from previous work experiences or time off from studies. There's a significant adaptation and adjustment that happens when we transition, particularly transitioning into university. And that includes a change in role, relationships, routines, assumptions. So the setting's different, the expectations are different, what we're doing is different, who we're engaging with is very different from what we may have been doing previously. And previous research by Gale and Parker has highlighted the need for higher education policy and practice to really embrace the inclusivity and diversity in transition planning and support. And that was another point I wanted to make sure was front of mind when looking at transition support, is ensuring that the support that we're providing recognises and acknowledges and encourages and embraces that inclusivity and diversity, rather than trying to find a way that we can make students who have challenges during transition change to fit the way that we want students to transition to university. So I really liked that sort of reflection of the importance of including and recognising inclusivity and diversity during transition. And a lot of the research that I looked at in pulling my project together really highlighted the importance of that inclusivity and diversity for all students and the benefits that all students will experience as a result. And I think that's really important to consider. Many of you might already be familiar with Alf Lisio's work, and I thank him very much for his support in providing me with some of these resources that I needed during my studies. Lisio's 5 senses really provided a bit of a background concept for me to keep in mind working through the experiences of students during transition. And I think it's a really helpful model. It's had iterations since, but this is the original 5 senses of successful transition model that Lisio had written about in 2006. And what I found useful was that when we talk about how students transition to university, it's important to recognise the various senses and the various experiences that they go through during that transition. And what Lisio's model identified was that students have 5 kind of key senses, key experiences that they're going through during that transition that we need to be mindful of and that universities can directly support the development of during that transition. So a sense of capability is how well students are prepared to be a student, how they understand that role, and the tasks that they might be required to undertake. And for a lot of students, that expectation, the knowledge of what university looks like, can be a real barrier. In terms of a sense of connectedness, Lisio talks about the way in which students connect with their peers, but also with other university staff, and how that helps them to build that sense of belonging as a student. In terms of resourcefulness, it's knowing who to ask for help, where you can get help from, what sort of questions to ask, how to manage challenges during their studies, and how to access support when they need it. And so this is particularly important for autistic students, knowing where support is available and how they can access that support. And then that sense of purpose is the way in which students feel connected to what they're studying and what that will contribute to their occupational outcomes. So students, it's really important, and we know it's really important for students to understand how does what they're learning contribute to their, the degree that they're doing as a whole, but also what they plan to be doing with that degree in the future, and understanding sort of the purpose of what they're engaging with. And then at the center of that, Lizio describes a sense of culture, which in later iterations was sort of reframed to be a sense of identity, talking about students' sense initially as their identity as a student, their identity as a pending professional, their identity as a graduate, and the way in which that supports their engagement with their studies, and having those clear values and understanding of their role at the university is really important. And I'll come back to this framework a little bit later on, because it was really helpful in working out ways in which universities can support transition from the information that I was provided by the participants in this research as well. I'm not going to go into this model overly much. If anyone has been to my previous webinar, or you've read my systematic literature review, there's plenty of detail in there about this one. But what I wanted to highlight was the purpose of this research was really about understanding the barriers and the facilitators to transition for students. And in doing so, I wanted to make sure that I wasn't just focusing on what is it that students need to do? What do students need to learn? What do students need to develop? I wanted to make sure that I was giving equal consideration to the support that students need, the skills that students can develop, but also what universities can do to support those aspects, and what role can universities play in supporting autistic students during the transition. So I wanted to make sure that there was a balance of looking at what the student can do and looking what the systems can do and what the systemic change is that's needed. And this was one of the key contributors to making sure that whenever I looked at the data that I had, I was making sure that I was looking at where does this fit in terms of who's responsible for addressing it, and making sure I wasn't, just focused on one particular area. As I've said, I'm not going to talk about the systematic literature review that I undertook, because that would be a whole nother webinar, and it is. If you want to go and read about it, there's a link in this slide to the publication, and also to a webinar that I presented with ADCET a few years ago. The main thing that came out of this for me was the lack of research around transition specifically, and the lack of research in an Australian context. And this sort of fueled the project that developed from here, in terms of looking at that transition experience for autistic students, and looking at that from an Australian perspective, and really exploring how students were going through that as well. So briefly, the research that I undertook was conducted with several students. I had 8 students that I conducted interviews with, and the real focus of that, and the reason that I use interpretive phenomenological analysis, which is a word I hope I don't have to use again for a while, the reason that I did that was that particular methodology allows you to look at the student's experience really closely, and gives that individual's experience a real presence. So the purpose of using this was to highlight the student's experience and privilege their experiences, so that it's an opportunity for students to share how they felt transition, what supports they felt they needed, the challenges they faced, the benefits they had, but really give the strength to their voices and give them an opportunity to share that. And there are a lot of research papers that have been conducted in, when looking at autistic students' experiences, and often family members are used as a proxy, or to give a different opinion. And I really wanted to sort of avoid that if I could, and just sort of talk to the students and take their experiences as they presented them. And this gave me that opportunity to do that. the information that was gathered from family members and staff was specifically focused on their experiences of providing support. So there was very few questions asked specifically about the engagement with the student or a specific student. It was about how did you undertake your role in supporting that, a student or autistic students generally at university, and what sort of challenges did you face? What sort of things did you implement? What worked really well? So it was more about understanding the support person's role than understanding their perspective of the student's experience. And I think that's really important for us to think about moving forward with research in this area. So I want to move on to talk about some findings, and hopefully that way there'll be an opportunity for some questions as well at the end. So the first set of data that I looked at was the students, and this was probably one of the biggest undertakings for this project, was looking at the students, the interviews with the students and their experiences. And as you can see from this slide, I had 8 students. There was a mix of male and female, and one student who preferred not to identify. And they ranged from 19 to 36 years of age, and they had varied pathways to and through university. So a lot of students, as you can see, had previously attempted university. Some had come through from vocational education pathways. Some had come through university pathway courses, and a couple of students had come directly, transitioned directly from high school. So there was a real mix of experiences in terms of how students had come to be in the current year or in the current degree that they were in. And several of the students, this was either their second or third degree or attempt at a degree. What was really important in relation to those students that had previously attempted university was they didn't describe it in terms of failing university, dropping out of university. Every student talked about their experiences previously as a previous attempt or trying university. I tried university previously, but the students themselves never talked about it in terms of failing university, dropping out of university. It was interesting to see how students described it as a stepping stone to where they were now. So that was something I hadn't thought about before, but was really interesting to see the consistency across these students of the way in which they perceived these experiences. For both of the female students that I interviewed, they had both been diagnosed after their initial attempt at university. And I think anecdotally, that's probably not something that's surprising for those of us who've worked in access and inclusion or disability advisor roles in the past. It's both students had a fairly recent diagnostic experience, and both students had previously attempted university but not been able to complete that particular degree. And so it was interesting seeing how their perspectives, and I'll give a little bit of an overview of that shortly, but how they differed from some of the students who were aware of their diagnosis prior to commencing university. So overall, when I looked at, I'll present the themes that came from students, then the themes that came from the interviews with support networks, and I'll briefly touch on the themes that came from support network surveys, which was a little bit less data, but still provided an interesting reflection on the data collected through the interviews as well. So the students that I interviewed very much talked about the importance of understanding themselves and their diagnosis. So the importance of knowing about their diagnosis. This was obviously particularly prevalent for students where they had received a late diagnosis or a recent diagnosis. But I also interviewed a student who had been diagnosed in childhood, had diagnosis of autism in childhood, but wasn't informed of that diagnosis. So when they started university, that was the first time for them that they had been aware of their autistic characteristics. And so for that student as well, understanding what was going on and why was really, really important. And I think one of the things that I was mindful of talking to students who had a recent diagnosis or re-diagnosis was that experience of processing that information and the way in which they were interpreting and understanding their previous experiences at university with a new lens, with a new understanding. And it definitely gave them a different way of reflecting on their experiences. For students who had a diagnosis in childhood and who knew of their autism, their description was very different. They actually talked about the fact that autism was part of who they were. They can't separate out the things that they find difficult because they're autistic as compared to the things they just find difficult because they're them. And that was interesting to talk through, because it was difficult for those students to tell me what sort of things might have been impacted during their transition because they were autistic. The students also noted that deciding to disclose was complex, which we all know that for autistic students, disclosing to academic staff if they need adjustments and those sorts of things are challenging. But students also talked about just disclosing to peers or in general being quite a difficult and complex decision. And one of the students sort of stopped at that point and said, well, I don't just go up to people and say, hi, my name's, Tim and I'm autistic. That would be weird. And so it sort of gave me that moment to realize it's not just a difficult task, but it's a really complex consideration, and not just because you don't know what the response is that you'll receive, but because it's just something that you don't always find the right time or place, or know when the right time or place is to do that. And I think that was obvious for a number of students that I interviewed. In relation to that understanding of self, some of the students also, when they had the ability to reflect back on their experiences, they reflected on the challenges that they had experienced. But in doing so, they often reflected this sense of internalized ableism, which is that self-discrimination. And what they would say is, I'm not good at this task. I can't do this task. I can't do this activity. I'm not good at socializing. I can't make friends. And that in itself was kind of, oh, okay, that's a very kind of direct way of putting it, but it also put the responsibility back on the student. And so the students then went from, I can't do this, to it's my responsibility to fix this, even for things that they could have had adjustments for. So students were sort of so focused on, I had all these difficulties, but I just have to try harder. I just have to be better at this. I just have to put, I've watched every YouTube there is on note taking, and that's how I will fix this problem. And it very much put the onus on the student, which was a different perspective to some students who had a bit more experience of adjustments and support. And so that was an interesting observation, because a lot of the previous research, and even I think my systematic literature review made the point that a lot of students weren't, research was showing students weren't demonstrating self-awareness in asking for supports. But in actual fact, when they do demonstrate it, it runs that risk of just leaning into that internalized ableism and this sense of, I just can't do this, and it's my responsibility to fix it, in which case, why would they be asking for support? So I think that's something we need to be mindful of, is being a bit proactive with addressing some of those things. Some of the students did describe mechanisms they used to avoid asking for help, but finding the answer in other ways, like listening into conversations about assignments to get the information that they might have missed in class. And so there were some of those descriptions where students were trying to not make it clear that they needed support and not make it clear that they might have been having difficulties. The second main theme that I sort of identified through the student interviews was this idea of persistence and resilience. And I think this is really, really important, because when we look at the data and we look at previous research, there's a really, really strong narrative of failure and negativity and challenge. And it sort of blurs out this persistence and resilience that students are actually demonstrating. One of the pieces of information I was kind of repeatedly going back to was the data on completion rates, and the fact that autistic students' completion rates were really low. But what I couldn't identify was how that data took into account students who returned and tried again. And from what I could read, those students were represented as an additional non-completion rather than re-engagement. And so I thought, oh, that's kind of not representative of what's happening. So I think persistence and resilience really stood out to me. All the students I spoke to had high anxiety, and significantly that was linked to sensory processing. So the students' anxiety, often they would talk about their sensory processing, and their anxiety as intertwined. It's being linked. There was this definite period of adjustment and needing to understand what university was like, but also this very different way of journeying to and through university, particularly through that first year. So many students had withdrawn, attempted previous degrees, left university, gone and done a vocational education course, and then come back to university. A very varied pathway, but all of these students had come back. They'd all returned to undertake their studies, and most of the students I spoke to were a fair way through their degree at this point. So this return had actually, for a lot of them, been quite a positive experience. And then the third theme that sort of came out of this was accessing and receiving support, the types of support students received, what they needed. Students all talked about various ways in which family supported them. They talked about the fact that they benefited from peer support and peer connection, but they didn't always find it. They talked about the support they received from universities. And there were two key areas that really stood out here. One was orientation programs, not surprisingly, and the other was mentoring programs that they participated in. And for both of those programs, students' experiences were significantly mixed. For some students, a really well-structured, targeted orientation program proved to be the biggest factor. For one student, it was just this most significant thing because it connected them to students in their degree. It gave them support networks to ask questions, all of those sorts of things. But then for a lot of students, accessing orientation was impossible. It was too chaotic, it was unstructured, it was noisy, it was unclear why they were there. They attended sessions that weren't related to their degree. It was just that kind of mixed experience that students talked about. And in terms of mentoring programs, it was similarly mixed. Some students had really positive experiences, and some students really didn't recognize the benefit that they had, that they were having if there was one. So, and often that came back to how the mentoring program was run, who they were engaging with. It really came down to individual, one particular mentor might have been good, another mentor might not have been so good. And a particular thing that students talked about is that they would only engage with the mentoring program if they felt that the mentor was really well educated and understood autism. And it was, a couple of students noted that they didn't feel like it was appropriate to just assume that someone, because they're in a psychology degree or a health sciences degree, might be interested or appropriate for that. And they sort of felt like there should be this layer of additional support that they needed to be, confident in. And some students just chose not to participate, and other students participated in more general mentoring programs that weren't specifically for autistic students. So it was definitely a mixed experience for the students. Oh, sorry about that. I didn't know. So the other group that I interviewed was support network members, and this was several disability advisors, a support worker and a family member, and a professional staff member at a university, to sort of learn about their experiences of providing support and what they found to be really important. And one of the things that really was clear was the need for early and ongoing support. And it was quite important in reflecting on that we need to be mindful of the resourcing requirements. That a lot of universities seem to have this expectation that autistic students will transition in 12 months. We give them lots and lots of support in the first 6 weeks and they'll be fine. we just set them up, and if they've had mentoring support, they'll be fine after that. That sort of expectation that we can sort of set them up and the rest of their degree will go smoothly, and that's not always the way for many students. So I think it was really clear that there needed to be some recognition of how important the first year is and being flexible with what that means. And when we consider the delays in seeking support, it just extends that out even further. And that there's this need for transition to support to be a little bit more than, it needs to sort of be before, during, and beyond that first chronological year of university. Definitely from the staff perspective, there was the benefits that they saw from mentoring programs and the benefits they saw from facilitated social connections. And students definitely felt that facilitated social support was useful, structured social support was useful. Support networks outside of the university was more just about what types of support students were accessing. And one of the key things that I do want to mention there was everyone that I interviewed in terms of staff and family all recognised that really significant challenge that we're all aware of, which is balancing autonomy and support need. So how do we teach students to advocate for themselves, to access support? How do we teach them how to, request assistance, but also, we're supporting them through that, but we know that they do need support to develop that. So how do we do that without kind of crossing that line and doing for them? And that was definitely recognised by everyone that was interviewed. And then the staff in particular provided a lot of recommendations for what could be done to support autistic students at university, and the importance of recognising each student and their individual needs, that every autistic student was different and they all needed a very different way. There's no one sort of setup that we can say, okay, all autistic students funnel into this mentoring program, or all autistic students need these, 5 accommodations. All students were distinctly different and had very different needs. And the importance as well of genuinely understanding autism from the perspective of autistic students, and the importance of that being a university-wide requirement rather than, maybe a small number of people that were aware of those needs. And then in addition to that, staff in particular and family members really noted that need for support, a supportive space on campus. And I know this is something that I've seen expanding in recent years, is the implementation of sort of autistic safe spaces, or I think we prefer to say safer spaces on campus, to enable students to engage with other autistic students, which would help to develop that sense of self and identity, but also provide a space that can be a retreat from some of the busyness that we know that university campuses can be from time to time as well. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the data from the surveys, other than to say a lot of it really supported what I heard through the interviews as well. I think one of the strongest points that came out of the parent survey data was the role of parents as advocates, and we asked parents about their role prior to university as well. And so a lot of that advocacy was in the high school years for parents who were supporting a post-high school student. And that was one of the biggest things that came out of the survey data, was this need to keep fighting for support and the challenges that they faced in doing that, because we know there's a big shift from providing that support in high school to moving to university. And similarly, staff reflected a lot of the themes that had come out from the interviews as well. That need for advocacy was recognised and reflected in staff survey responses as well. And the need for recognising the different types of support that university staff would provide, which was it's not necessarily all accommodations, but also that emotional and practical support as well as academic support. So overall, I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but when we look at the individual and the systemic requirements for supporting transition, There are several individual things that we can support students to work on. So we can help them with developing that sense of identity. Students can work on that self-awareness and knowing what supports they need. We can help to support self-disclosure and help seeking. And we can, we need to recognize that persistence and resilience. But when we look across the systemic things that we can address as well, there was quite a significant number of those. One of the things I'm not talking about today in this webinar, but I do want to acknowledge, is that there was definitely a recognition of the need for high school transition support to improve. This wasn't the focus of my research because I know there's plenty of research in this space, but it was definitely highlighted by parents and staff in terms of the inconsistencies really in terms of that support. So that's another area that really requires some additional exploration. So as a result of the areas that the students had identified and the areas that staff and family members had identified challenges in and facilitated things that worked, the strengths they experienced, I tried to pull together some recommendations. There's a couple of additional recommendations which are focused on obviously that need for high school transition. So I'm not going to support. So I'm not going to talk about that today, but as well as those, that need for preparation support, that high school transition and preparation, there was 10 additional recommendations, which I want to talk through briefly today. The most important thing I think that came out of this research, and I think helped looking at the framework of systemic change and individual change, is these recommendations only work if they're implemented together, or at least some of which in combination. No one of these strategies will support students to successfully transition. We really need to take a holistic approach to how we support autistic students from a university-wide perspective and from a student perspective and in between. So one of the things that I think is really important is, yes, supporting students to develop skills in help seeking and disclosure. And one of the things that I suggested in my thesis was around providing scaffolding for that process. So if you can provide a script for students that, an email script or a spoken script that can prepare them for those discussions. So, if you meet with a student and you're developing an access plan, then can you support them with how they then communicate what that means, what they need from that, how that affects them? That sort of, open disclosure, having that scaffolded can really make a difference in how students will approach that. Because otherwise, students are finding that a very vague concept to approach or to know when or how to do that. So supporting that in a more structured way could be very useful as well. And it is important to support students to do that help seeking because, as an access and inclusion advisor, for example, I know I can't be there, at every instance where students need support. So developing some of those skills is really important, or supporting some structure around that is really important. I also think it's really helpful to develop and promote resources that inform family members about the students' rights and responsibilities at university. The family members that I spoke to had very little knowledge or awareness of the Disability Discrimination Act, the Disability Standards for Education, and so they didn't feel confident that they knew what the students' rights were. And I think that's an area that could be supported to enable parents to provide support, because all of the students that I spoke to, I think except one, talked about having some support provided by family and how important that was. So I think there are really good examples on ADCET website, the Parents and Carers Guide. There's a resource on the UniSA website where I used to work. We used to provide a guide for parents, carers and friends. And those sorts of resources that provide support to those people that are providing support to students can be really critical in informing them of the types of things that they can assist with as well. I think implementing strategies that are responsive to the potentially disrupted transition experience of autistic students is really important. if we're recognizing that this is a pattern, if we see a lot of students, and there were lots of students I spoke to who had withdrawn, taken 6 months off, come back after a year, various different iterations. What was interesting was that most of them returned to the same university. So they obviously felt they had established a connection there. And some students, it was actually really good because they already had an access plan set up, usually as a result of whatever had caused them to take leave. So they'd kind of finally got to the point of connecting, but it was too late to set up anything proactively. It was kind of, okay, let's take some leave, come back in 6 months and see how we go. And it had worked quite well for some students, particularly those who had connections they could re-engage with when they came back. So I think recognizing that is a pathway for a lot of autistic students, and having something in place, so a contact person that they can engage with, someone that perhaps contacts them just before they're due to return, setting up those proactive mechanisms if we can would be amazing. And I recognise that there is a need within all of these to, really champion the need for resources and time and support in doing those. In terms of promoting mechanisms to enable students to engage an advocate, the students that I spoke to, most of them actually really appreciated and valued support their parents were providing for them in terms of advocacy. But the parents also recognised that there was a need to balance that. So if we can put in place formal mechanisms to support the inclusion of an advocate, and one of the people I spoke to talked about an NDIS worker as their advocate, setting up a formal plan for that and actually approaching it. I think in my experience, we've often been hesitant to do that because of privacy reasons, which is fine. But if we set up a formal arrangement, then it is the student's decision and it's up to their discretion whether they approve that or not. The formal mechanism of doing that, if we can set up some sort of a discussion, if we can set up a formal approval, we also have an opportunity there to talk to students about how will we implement this, and then how will we move beyond implementing this? What can we work on so that this isn't something that you need through your whole degree? And that can be an actual formal discussion. It means you've got place and space for that discussion to happen. So you're not sort of doing it without the student's knowledge. It is part of that discussion as to how you'll develop those help-seeking skills and that autonomy in the process of doing this. It's also really important to promote strategies that allow students to engage before they commence their university studies. I know at UniSA, where I was working previously, we would be open to discussions with prospective students. That can be a real challenge if you don't have the resourcing to manage it. So I think it's really important to recognise that could be a critical factor in supporting students to transition, and how do we champion the need for that to be considered within those resourcing requirements as well. And I guess that links into being available if students do take leave, and someone that student can contact when they return. It's really important that we obviously have adequately funded equity and disability services. And I feel a little bit silly saying that, but we all know that's something that we need to be championing, because we need to recognise that transition support for autistic students doesn't end at the end of first year, and trying to limit access to supports or limit the engagement with students is just going to create more work and challenges in the long run. We really want them to have that successful transition, even if that is 18 months, not 12 months. We want to make sure that support's in place. So I think it's really important to emphasise that, and I acknowledge that as well. It's really important to consider ways in which we can support students to engage in orientation. Orientation programs are, the initial introduction to university for autistic students, and I think these are really key to supporting successful ongoing experiences. From the students that I spoke to, I think the key things are recognising the need for structure around orientation, and in terms of structure, making sure that the things that autistic students engage in are meaningful, purposeful. We'll support them with developing connections, but recognise the sensory and social challenges that come with that. So allowing students the opportunity to participate in them, giving them an inclusive way to do that. One way would be creating really clear schedules of orientation activities. Another is having a sensory map of orientation activities. There's a really good example here in South Australia. The South Australian Museum has a sensory map of their exhibits. So the time of day that it can get really busy, which exhibits are likely to be really busy. So it helps people to navigate the space and know the expectations. And when it comes to sensory processing for autistic students, some of the ways in which we can address that is providing a little bit more predictability around what that's going to be like. And then students can choose how they want to interact with that as well. Promoting autism spaces on campus, having a space that's available for students to withdraw to or to spend time in with other autistic students if they wish to, is a really important way of making that orientation more accessible, having that opportunity, and potentially having an orientation buddy. And one thing I would say, and students reflected this to me, and I probably didn't understand what they were suggesting until recently, but we need to be a little bit proactive with what we do provide in terms of supports, and not expect, for example, at orientation, that students are going to know what assistance they need. It's really a really challenging thing for students to do if they don't know what orientation is going to look like. So I think potentially having a list of suggested strategies. I know Darlene's going to try and move me along.
Okay, so I've just got about eight. Sorry, Darlene,
Yep.
We've just got about 8 minutes to go. We have got a few questions, but I don't want to rush you. So let's see how we go.
No, that's good. Basically, yeah, that was probably my key thing. I think we really need to make orientation more accessible, but also make sure that we present suggestions. So myself as an autistic person, I went to graduation last week and I didn't ask for accommodations, which in hindsight was really silly. But I didn't ask for accommodations because I didn't know exactly what graduation was going to look like on the day, and I didn't know what I would need on the day. But when I got there, I sort of thought, there are actually lots of people here who are working at graduation who do know what this would have looked like, and it could have been useful to have a discussion with them. So I think thinking about how we can proactively support students to identify those support needs rather than expecting them to come to us with them. Obviously, the need for an inclusive university campus that celebrates and recognises neurodiversity as part of the campus culture. I'm not even going to go into universal design for learning because there are people, Elizabeth, heads up to you, that present on this quite a bit and can give you the goss on UDL. But it is really important that we make those attempts at making our learning and teaching accessible for all students. And then I guess the other part of this is looking at those, that Lizio's model. And I've got an example here, looking at all of the different ways that we can make the university transition experience more accommodating, and how we can support students. I think this is probably one of the key things, is how we can support students to develop that strong sense of self and identity in doing so, and how that helps to support them throughout their studies as well. So I'm going to hand over to Darlene, because I think you might have some questions for me.
Yep, we do. Did you want to put up your slide with your contact details, or the last
I will.
one? There we
go.
You are. Thank you.
Yes.
So Alison at Alison Nuske, is that nuske.com.au, and Alison has a website too, which is alisonnuske.com.au. So thank you, and the links are in the chat as well. Thank you, Kylie. Fabulous. That's great. All I'm thinking about is now updating all our content on ADCET to reflect your PhD and your findings. The recommendations were fabulous. So really concrete things I think all of us can do to make sure that, students with autistic students are more successful at study. There's a couple of probably more questions than we're going to get through. So just trying to work. If people want to upvote, that might help, because that'll help me prioritise what questions I ask.
I'm
There was a
happy to
question.
answer any in an email later too,
Yep,
Darlene,
that'd
if
be
that's
great.
helpful.
Thank you. So we will kind of, capture all that and add that to the website. So one was one of your recommendations with students who identified as attempting and then going back to the same uni to ask why. For example, knowing something about the uni is better than trying somewhere else, or they'd know some limitations to consider how to work around it rather than having to contact, as not all contacts are positive, or just more detail about the issue. Sorry, I didn't probably read that as a question. So was there anything else you think that taken into consideration why students did return to the same university?
I didn't ask. I think that most of the students, it was kind of just an assumed that's what they would do in a way. And it might be that idea of better the devil you know. It's easier to return to somewhere where you've already sort of had some support established. And most students that talked about withdrawing had withdrawn after some sort of crisis or similar, where they'd finally gotten connected to support and then taken a break. So I think they returned because they felt that they had that support to come back to.
Yeah, that's good. Did representation of autistic or neurodiverse individuals within university staff come up as a positive factor affecting senses of belonging for students?
It is a really important one because one of the key things that Lizzio's framework now talks about is that sense of identity and how that's built through recognizing role models. And if you look at the literature around autistic role models and autistic academics, you'll see that there's a huge amount of ableism and concern around disclosure. So I think that's something we need to really work on as a university, is making it a safe space, not just for students, but for academic staff and professional staff to disclose, so that autistic students do have representation within the staff cohort as well.
Definitely. How big was the influence of high school experiences have on the success of the transition? For example, those that have been significantly bullied about disclosing their diagnosis or diagnoses. Did any of that come
Yeah,
up in the
I
research?
no, it didn't. I think what did come up, or what students touched on in that sense, was negative social experiences. And the students that talked about social experiences all talked about wanting a fresh chance, that high school sucked and I didn't have a lot of friends, and this was my opportunity to make friends. What was really disappointing is all of those students that said they really, really wanted to make friends and they wanted a fresh start did not have any success, or not really significant success in making those connections. And so that was definitely a strong theme, is wanting social connection, not necessarily being able to find the right social connection.
Yeah. Another question is, for those students who did not have an access plan before taking a break from uni, or had an access plan for another need, such as mental health, how important is it to develop an access plan before returning to university? Are universities, departments even open for making access plans for students who are still on a break? Probably a wide question.
Well, in my experience, I would have, and I would highly recommend doing it early, because you really need to be having that discussion before things start rolling, if you can. And yes, a couple of the students I spoke to did have access plans for different disabilities, and then added the autism to their access plan. Most of them didn't disclose their autism specifically on their access plan, but they did find that having some specific needs in there that were related to autism was important. So even students that already had access plans in place, it didn't necessarily address what they needed that was autism specific until they revised it.
Excellent. Looking at the time, we are running out. There's a couple of other questions we'll put to Alison in the and we'll
Sure.
put that onto the website. One was in relation to TAFE and the transition, and the question if it's similar. And I think there would be learnings or recommendations that we could certainly kind of embed or put to a TAFE transition as well. The great thing is Victoria are actually putting on transition officers at the moment as we speak around with all their TAFEs. That'll be interesting to see, and we'll certainly watch that space and provide this webinar for them to hopefully upskill them in their role. So thank you, Alison. Look, it's just absolutely brilliant. It's fabulous to look. Your recommendations are so practical and so doable for anybody that wants to kind of look at successful transition for students. So thank you so much for that, and thank you for giving your time so freely to us. right through your PhD, and just really commend you
No
on the great
problem.
work that you've done. It's absolutely brilliant. And yeah, I think it's going to be a significant game changer. We'll keep promoting it. And as I said, we're looking at updating our content to reflect your recommendations, very much so. So thank you,
Sounds
everybody.
good.
And we've had some great comments in the chat too of just congratulations and thank you for your leadership in this. It's absolutely, fabulous. We will send the link
Thank you.
out in an email. We'll also send out a short survey. We encourage you to fill that in. We have a couple of events coming up. We have the Disability Officer, a linchpin on the UD campus. And the links are going into the chat as I speak, the magical world of that. We also have a UDL symposium coming up on the 12th of June, which will be online and in person in Melbourne. And we're calling for abstracts, so please get your abstracts into us. And the other exciting thing is we're having our awards again this year, Accessibility and Action Awards. So please nominate a person or a team. It'd be really exciting to get some great nominations. We already are having some fabulous nominations come in. So thank you, Alison, and thank you, everybody. Thank you, team. Thank you, Jason, and thank you, everybody, for joining us. Have a great day. Bye.
Thanks, Darlene. Bye.